Next Chapter Podcasts.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
Telling these stories is not a moment of shame. It's a moment of triumph. And in this space, you mentioned us, Montgomery, Tulsa, Galveston is about to get a Juneteenth museum, all of these kinds of things. The South is leading the charge.
Bourbon is what's bringing people to Louisville, but when they're here, they're getting a chance to, go to the Ollie Museum, go to the Derby Museum, see all of these other things that, weren't available without all of this bourbon tourism.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say.
Hello, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a new South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumoftheNewSouth.org. Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone of the Washington Post, coming to you from the University of Maryland, where I teach, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Greene II, a professor of history at Claflin University. Our New South Season 2 explores the complexities of the many New Souths that make up today's New South. The series highlights opportunities and challenges that different communities face, diving into censorship and healthcare, tourism and religion, struggles for rights and resources, and the global reverberations of New South culture.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the show a Signal Award and Anthem Award winner. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South explores the intersection of history, tourism, and cultural identity in the South.
From museums that redefine how history is remembered to the booming bourbon industry, the stories we chose to showcase shape how the South is understood, both by those who call it home and by those who visit.
Yes, tourism has long been a major industry in the region, but what it highlights has evolved over time. Once dominated by romanticized images of the Old South, today's tourism landscape includes powerful narratives about resilience, cultural excellence, and untold histories.
But before we dive into our conversations, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Greene to provide us with some brief insight on the shifting role of tourism in the South.
One of the U.S. South's most important industries is tourism. In 2024, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper announced that his state was number 5 in domestic visitation among all U.S. states, just behind California, Florida, Texas, and New York. This accounted for $35.6 billion spent by visitors in 2023. All across the region, reputation for hospitality, mild year-round climate, and a rich history have all helped the South become a destination for tourists, both foreign and domestic. What exactly that tourism industry has showcased over the years has, however, changed. Once, the moonlight and magnolias of the South, old plantation homes and other sites that venerated a reverence for the so-called Old South, were key parts of tourism. Cities such as Charleston and New Orleans played up a classic charm while suppressing the very real problems plaguing their communities. Now, however, Southern tourism has taken on several forms, with Black Americans leading the way in pushing tourists to experience the entirety of Southern history, warts and all. Blues tourism to places such as Memphis, Tennessee, country music tourism in Nashville, Tennessee, and tourism based around voodoo in New Orleans has dramatically changed how people think about tourism in the U.S. South. All of these sites and many more have delivered to tourists a more nuanced and vibrant version of what the South has been and what it currently is today. Museums such as the International African American Museum, or IAAM, in Charleston, South Carolina, have given visitors an awe-inspiring interpretation of the Southern past and present. Offering up a history that begins before slavery in West Africa, the IAAM worked closely with local residents in Charleston to make sure the history showcased there was one that included every voice, not just those of the privileged and well-off. The IAAM, which opened in 2023 after 20 years of planning and fundraising, is just one of several stars in a constellation of museums and historic sites across the U.S. South that emphasize Black history and culture. Other sites, such as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, make clear to visitors that the difficult histories of the U.S. South are still valuable to learn in the first decades of the 21st century. A museum dedicated to the difficult history of lynching, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice has provoked tears, difficult conversations, and even tougher reflections on the dark side of Southern and American history. On the other end of the tourism spectrum are sites and trails that emphasize the good life side of Southern culture. One such trail is the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky. The trail includes numerous distilleries and offers a unique look at one of the South's best-known adult beverages. The trail has become a unique way to think about the South's long relationship to American cuisine, drink, and the desire to have a good time, even in the midst of troubling circumstances. The South's tourism industry allows visitors and native Southerners alike the opportunity to learn more about the U.S. South. The industry will only grow with time. This means that the stories told through tourism will only increase in importance as debates and arguments about Southern history, culture, and identity intensify in the years to come. Our first guest is Dr. Tonya M. Mathews. As the president and CEO of the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, Dr. Mathews leads an institution dedicated to preserving and sharing the powerful stories of African American history, named one of the world's greatest places in 2024 by Time magazine. Before taking the helm at IAAM, she served as the president and CEO of the Michigan Science Center, where they founded the STEMinista Project, an initiative designed to inspire young girls to see themselves as future leaders in STEM fields.
Her commitment to education and empowerment has earned her numerous accolades, including being recognized as one of the most influential women in Charleston by the Charleston Business Magazine in 2021. She is also a published poet, with her work featured in 100 Best African American Poems, edited by the legendary Nikki Giovanni. Our New South welcomes Dr. Tonya M. Mathews. All right, Dr. Tonya Mathews, thank you very much for joining our New South podcast. First, I want to ask you, as we ask all of our guests, to tell them where you are and what it is you do, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into that, what it is you do.
So I am currently in Charleston, South Carolina, which is the heart of the Low Country. If you know anything about South Carolina, you know we like to divide ourselves into regions, the great countries of the great state of South Carolina. And so the Low Country we're here at the coast. You may also hear the Low Country shouted out in reference to talking about the history of the Gullah Geechee people, like this special group of African Americans that have held on to all the culture, all the vibes in this space. And down here, I am the president and CEO of the International African American Museum, the second largest African American history museum of its kind. And we hover above the sacred site of Gadsden's Wharf, the former site of our nation's most prolific transatlantic slave trading ports.
And you once said that Duke University gave you your first great awakening. And so what was that great awakening for you? And did it have anything to do with being in the South?
That's actually a great question. I think it had to do with being an American, being a Black person in America, if we can be candid about that. I mean, the South has a lot to work through and perhaps a lot to atone for, but we are a country. And so a lot of the themes that run through from Maine to Southern California. And so, at Duke, I am a nerd. Classic. I love school and school loved me back, right? So school was my thing. My mother was a teacher. My father believed in education, particularly for his girls. So school was my thing. So I was very, very good, valedictorian, all the AP classes coming out with a 4 point something or other. So I was excited to go to Duke, to be with my people, my tribe, the rest of the nerds who could convince their parents to pay for such a thing. And so I was coming down there, and within those first few weeks, I started to meet the confrontations, the doubts, flat out conversations that where folks would state out loud that they believed that I had taken their best friend's place at Duke University, due to affirmative action or special selection, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in those moments, I had the advantage of being able to ask them, well, what was your best friend's SAT score? Because I happened to know mine was going to be higher, right? True nerd, right? So I had the receipts. But as that continued to happen to me, I realized that they were confronting me just based on assumption and based on what I look like. And the only reason that I was surviving is because I could be cocky enough to say, hey, well, what was their score? Like, what did they do? There are other personality types, other folks that were ready to shrink. That were not ready to defend themselves when confronted. And so that is actually when I began the shift into, if I'm looking in retrospect, it was probably the first time I began fighting on behalf of someone other than myself. When I realized that the reason I could survive these questions was more about my personality, my orientation, and all those kind of things than it was about whether or not I deserved this particular seat in this particular house. And I began reacting against that. And so that's definitely what I consider those awakening years, when I realized that I would be confronted before I even opened my mouth. And there was something that intuitively struck me about that as just not being right.
Again, Dr. Mathews, we're so happy to have you on the show today. You've already talked a bit about how the South has changed you, but what was it in particular that inspired you to take on this position at the International African American Museum?
That is a really, really good question. And one day when I write my memoir, there'll be a really good answer for it. Okay. But in the meantime, y'all about to get the answer kind of off the top. And so it was interesting. When I got the call, about, perhaps throwing my hat in the ring, I was actually associate provost at Wayne State University, right? So I got on the phone and was talking with the recruiter. It was a national search firm. I realized that we were talking about an institution that one of my mentors had introduced to me more than a decade before. Right? More than a decade before. And so at that point, I was thinking that they were looking for their next CEO, that the museum was open, thriving. I'm like, so what do you guys want to be over your next 10 years? And I started to ask those kinds of questions. And then they said, no, it's not open yet. I said, what do you mean it's not open yet? Yeah, I've been working on this thing for a really long time. So at that point, it was nearly 20 years that this project had been in process. And I was then becoming aware that what I was being asked to do was to build, to be the last peg in this great puzzle to help actually build the museum, that it was still dirt on the ground and no walls to speak of. And that it would be the International African American Museum that was hovering over a top of a former transatlantic slave trading port, that it was going to be big in that space, and that the capital campaign was 99% done. And so then I got into the interview process. I was learning more, and being in that conversation forced me to ideate. It forced me to mock up a vision sort of just in case. And I think I fell in love with the stories that we could tell. And then I snuck into Charleston. I do this, right? I always like to get my own lay of the land. You don't want to go in and have them just roll out the red carpet. You want to try to understand what it's like when people don't know who you are. Right. And so I snuck into Charleston, wandered around the construction site a little bit, took a picture of the sun coming up at sunrise. And I was like, okay, I think we can do this. And so, that was it. And then the very last thing was, and my mama's going to be so proud of me. And so that was what led me to the role.
No, that's excellent. And I have to say, I'm a native Georgian, so I can understand the East Coast appeal. And it feels like a gathering of Black folk in the South, just all over the place for this conversation. We've seen in recent years that the growth of museums dedicated to Black history and Black culture, most notably the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian Institute. Could you tell us in the audience a little bit about how the IAAM's mission is a bit different from those other museums?
So one of the things that distinguishes the International African American Museum is indeed the international part. And we do that in twofold, which is one, origin stories, which everyone expects. Okay, this is great. We're going to talk about the origins of African, some of the African ancient civilizations. And our timeline does indeed go all the way back to 300 BCE. But the other part of the international is an intentional connection to the African diaspora. Right? Where we have galleries that specifically do a mishmash. So you don't know what part of the world you are in, right? Because that spice, that flavor, that culture, that hairstyle, that approach to art could have been from any one of these different places. And so in doing that, right, and connecting that origin story with current African diaspora connections rooted in African American history, our museum has what I would say is the energy. Right? People are very surprised when they walk in, and the space has good energy. Yes, we know where we are, and we tell the story of slavery and enslavement, but basically we tell the story in a way that hints at, as the song says, how we got over. Right? And we got over through this constant simultaneous intersection of trauma and joy, not one or the other, but you can sort of feel that in the space. And so we feel that not like a party, but like a heartbeat or a drum beat. So that is part of, I think, what distinguishes the way we tell the stories and the energy and the way we activate around the mission in our museum.
And so many people come to Charleston, if they're not going directly to the museum, they're going there to go to the beach.
Yep.
That's why I was there a few years ago. And Charleston's a big tourism, has a large tourism industry, and the restaurants and the street with the colored doors.
Doors. Rainbow Row.
Rainbow Row. So then how do you fit what you're overseeing there into the idea of tourism for the city of Charleston?
Yeah. We had a strong ally and supporter actually in the head of our Convention and Visitors Bureau, which we call Explore Charleston. The president and CEO of our CVB understood that we were missing an audience. Real talk is real talk, right? If you're missing a story, if your brand is tourism based on history and storytelling, that's what our brand is, and you're missing a story, you're basically missing an entire segment of your audience. You're missing your customers, right? You're missing an entire section of cultural heritage tourism on that side. And so she was very, very excited to be able to broaden the base of stories, and she knew what that would do. The other part that I brought to the table in some of my conversations with that team and with others was we were also coming into a space, be it the internet, be it 2020, be it whatever, where folks were having some real conversations about what was missing in the way that we tell history. And Charleston was on the cusp, perhaps, of finding itself put into the category of nostalgia as opposed to history and cultural heritage tourism. And that would not have been good for us. I was like, y'all, at this point, we are literally competing with Montgomery. Okay. They are down there telling all kinds of truth. And so this is going to be, sort of the challenge. So also understanding that audiences themselves were coming in where you don't know exactly what the story is, but you know when the story is not, and you can sense when something is missing. And that was part of the space that we were about to step into as we had these conversations. And so all of that, though, was still on paper, estimations, fingers crossed, focus groups, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't until we really opened the doors, got to see what our audience looked like, where they were coming from, that we understood, we were right. In our first 18 months, we had more than 260,000 visitors and program attendees at the museum from all walks of life, right? Everybody's coming in from everywhere, including and especially the home team. We are overrepresenting visitors from the Carolinas, which again, that was prayer. That was prayer right there. That we were very conscious about stewarding living history. And then folks were going to come in there with as much knowledge coming in as we were going to give them on their way out. And so all of that has worked in a really interesting way to make us a robust addition to the tourism and the cultural heritage tourism in our state and actually in this region of the country.
I have an attraction to the South. And so I wonder for you, because like me, you grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. We're not South.
Fake
but
South.
We're still South. Fake South.
Fake South.
Fake South.
Listen. Mm-hmm.
So what is your idea of what we are debating in this podcast or trying to figure out of the New South? What were your ideas of the South?
Yeah.
And what is your idea of the South that you're living in now?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think, want to be kind, authentic, empathetic, all at the same time. So let me start off by saying, the South is a thing. Anywhere where the phrase bless your heart is an insult means you are walking into territory where this is a thing. Right. And so, it is a thing, and it is a space and a place that understands how to wield power in ways that us DC folks have no idea. I like to tell folks, listen, folks in DC are amateurs when it comes to politics, when it comes to controlling people, when it comes to controlling the narrative. The South has perfected that because it has had to reinvent its story to move beyond this history. But reinventing your story and reinventing yourself are two different things. And I would say that the South is much farther along in reinventing its story than actually reinventing itself, right? But that said, the South also simultaneously, and now I'm just bragging because these my cousins, that gave rise to one of the greatest American communities with one of the greatest American stories of all time, right? That's going to be the African American community and the African American story. And I say one of the greatest so everyone else can get their jabs in and claim your own as well. And so there has got to be something here. My first few months, and sort of those kind of things here, I won't lie. I was like, listen, let me tell you where I won't be when the sun goes down. Anywhere. Okay. Anywhere. Because I was ingrained with the images and the stories and the history. Spanish moss hanging over some oak trees was not beautiful for me until at least my first year and a half sort of being here. It would really tense me up, right? Because those were the stories, those were the images, and those were the things that I knew. And they were true, right? They were true. But it wasn't until I met my adoptive family, when I began to go into people's homes, when I discovered Fields Farm and all of these things, the market, when I realized those things are true, but they aren't the only things. And so here's the community. Here's the culture. Here's the story. Here are the kids who climbed up in these trees when they were doing their coming of age thing. Here are the folks that had learned to shuck this or scale that, again, which I will never learn how to do. I'm like, I'm glad you're just telling me the story. Sort of in these things. And so as my picture of the South became fuller, that is when I began to recognize this as home. And so there's a lot that's happening. And so I think mostly what it represents is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for the South to escape its stereotype of being monolithic, just white, just Black, just Southern. Absolutely not. The South has the opportunity to say, no, we are as global as any of these other communities. Look at us. There are also Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies that are moving here. Oh, my goodness. And technology based at that. So the South has the opportunity to say, no, we are not just rural and we are not just agriculture. We are still the best at rural living and the best at agriculture, but we are also bringing these technology companies. This is where your Dreamliner is being built, right? Sort of in those spaces. And so I think what's happening is the South has an opportunity to evolve into whatever its next sense of self wants to be, but it's going to have to be intentionally taken. Opportunity may be knocking on the door, but you better unlock that bad boy and open it, invite somebody in for biscuits to see and to make sure that we take advantage.
And so now we've got these museums, we've got the Lorraine Motel, we've got Birmingham, where you end up staring at the church. How comfortable should we be with all of this as sightseeing?
Listen, this for us is the Holy Grail. We want to tell the stories of history where history happened. When we're in our field, our profession of history museums and curation, we want to tell the story of Septima Clark, where Septima Clark lived, worked, and learned, right? And so that's part of what we want to do. And what history museums, art museums, whatever, also have to do is we have to be able to bring the story to the people where they are. This is why you talk about stories about Montgomery, Alabama at a New York History Museum, right? You got to bring where they are, but it's also why that New York History Museum is also pointing out the window to the African burial ground, right? Because you want to talk about things where they happen. And so what is unique and amazing and gratifying right now is that history museums and sites of conscience are able to reclaim these spaces and tell these stories. Telling these stories is not a moment of shame. It's a moment of triumph. And in this space, we're talking, you mentioned us, Montgomery, Tulsa, Galveston is about to get a Juneteenth museum, all of these kinds of things. The South is leading the charge.
Again, Dr. Mathews, this has been absolutely fantastic. I can say as someone who has become an adopted son of South Carolina, the work you're doing at the International African American Museum is nothing short of phenomenal. And this has been a fantastic interview.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our next guest is Sara Havens.
Sara is a leading voice in whiskey, bar culture, and Southern spirits tourism. As a seasoned spirits writer for Alcohol Professor, The Bourbon Review, Bourbon Plus Magazine, and Food and Dining Magazine, Sara has spent years uncovering the best distilleries, bars, and bourbon experiences that make the South a must-visit destination for whiskey lovers.
Her passion for bourbon culture shines through in her books. The Bar Belle Volumes 1 and 2, collections of her best-loved columns from Leo Weekly, a body of work that even earned her the Best Column Award at the 2011 Alt Weekly Awards, As a director of whiskey at Cask X, she also helps investors explore the booming world of bourbon and Scotch whiskey barrel ownership. And if you're looking to experience Southern hospitality firsthand, Sara leads engaging, entertaining, and educational bourbon tastings, perfect for visitors eager to dive into Kentucky's signature spirit. Our New South welcomes Sara Havens.
All right, everyone. We are happy and pleased to have with us this afternoon Sara Havens, who is known in some circles as the Bar Belle. Welcome to our New South. And usually what we do is we like to ask our guests first a bit about yourself, who you are and what you do for a living, and what brings you to the podcast today.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be talking with you too. And I've listened to several episodes, and it's an honor to be on here. But a little bit about myself. I'm actually from Ohio. Went to journalism school at Ohio University. And then after that, I got a newspaper job down in Louisville, Kentucky. So I've kind of been down here ever since. And it just turns out while I was down here, the bourbon boom started kind of happening. And I was writing about kind of Louisville nightlife, culture, arts and entertainment, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, bourbon kind of crept in the picture, and I started focusing on that. And now I kind of write about bourbon full time, and I have a job in the industry as well. And so, yeah, it's kind of, I get to, I guess, merge my two passions and write about what I love. So.
Now, that's really interesting to me. There's this idea of not only writing about bourbon, but also the place of Louisville and Southern culture. Could you talk a little bit about what it is about bourbon and bar culture in the South that has interested you for so long? Because you've been writing about Louisville bourbon culture for about 20 years now.
Moving to Louisville from, a smaller town in Ohio, I was just kind of enamored with the bar culture here. The bars were open. I was 23. The bars were open till 4 a.m. It was at the time, I was just like, oh, this is, there's 300 bars here in town, and just exploring each one. Each one has its own little niche. And, we've got blues bars and cocktail bars and sports bars and dive bars and, and just there's so much here to offer. They say Louisville is the northernmost southern city and the southernmost northern city. So we're kind of right there in the middle. So it's just an interesting, kind of culture phenomenon, I guess, with all the bars, and and it's kind of indicative of the South too. Every city I've traveled to has a great little culture of nightlife going on.
And is there anything particular about the South and bourbon that people should know about? Is that what is that relationship, and what is really the birth of that relationship?
Sure.
Because you mentioned that the bourbon boom really happened.
Yeah.
About the time you got there.
Yeah. So Kentucky is basically the epicenter of the bourbon boom. Of course, you can make bourbon in any state legally, and every state actually does have distilleries, and they're making some good bourbon. But 95% of it is made kind of in the Kentucky, Tennessee region. We have, just because of that limestone shelf, a lot of people, the Scottish and the Irish, were coming over and settling in the area, and they brought kind of their equipment, their distilling equipment, their knowledge, and all that. And they started distilling right here. Some people say it reminds them a lot of their home. It's so green here, so the Irish and Scottish, kind of took to the area. So yeah, so I, like I said, 95% of it's made here. We're kind of synonymous with bourbon. So us being in the South, I think bourbon is definitely a Southern spirit.
I was wondering if bourbon in Kentucky in particular, and bourbon and whiskey to the South, throughout the South, and the whole history of moonshining, which is, I think, part of the derivative, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, how much of it has to do with the rebellious nature of the South? Given you had the whiskey rebellion pop up, given you had NASCAR born out of moonshining and guys and women running their spirits throughout the South and running from the cops.
Right.
Is that part of it?
I think so. Especially if you look at it through, the Bible Belt, if you look with those glasses on, then what bourbon making isn't really the best thing to do, and the fact that it's been here for hundreds of years, I think a lot of the distillers' descendants were moonshiners, probably, especially during Prohibition, there's only 6 distilleries allowed to be opened.
You said that there was a boom when you got there.
Yeah. So bourbon was kind of out of favor in the, I'd say, late 70s, 80s, 90s. People were drinking clear spirits, vodkas, tequila, gin, like Zimas,
Sure.
those kind of things. So there's people kind of look back and credit it the kind of the fascination with the whole original cocktail making from Mad Men, the TV show. That kind of spurred a lot of bourbon bars to open. People wanted to go back to the classic cocktails, the whole mixologist culture. And then also at the same time, the bourbon producers were trying to kind of mimic the Scotch vibe by let's put out, instead of just making all this bottom shelf bourbon, let's put out some like single barrels and some, higher quality top shelf type of products. So that kind of got elevated the category as well. And so this was probably about 2004, 5, 6.
Okay.
The first distillery to come back into Louisville, as a tourist attraction. It didn't even come until 2013. So we're talking all of this has kind of happened here, and especially in Louisville, since 2013. Now there's 12 distilleries in town, just in Louisville.
I think a lot of our listeners are probably intrigued by this episode because of their enjoyment of bourbon and other spirits. But I bet at least a few are aware of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Could you tell us first a bit about the overall state of the bourbon tourism industry? You just mentioned a moment ago how it's already experienced considerable growth during your time in Louisville. Can you talk a bit more first about how it has developed during your time in Louisville?
Yeah. So the Kentucky Distillers Association, they started the trail as, kind of a way to get people to come here, kind of like the Napa Valley region. So it started in 1999 with about 6 distilleries, and now there's 46. Yeah, but there's actually over 100 distilleries in Kentucky, but not all of them, choose to be a part of it, just because I think prices and stuff like that. If they're smaller operations, they got to get started first. So yeah, I think I read a statistic. There was like 2.5 million visitors to the Kentucky Bourbon Trail last year. So it's definitely grown considerably. I mean, people are flocking in from all walks of life just to take in a couple distilleries. It's not an actual trail that you start and end. You just kind of go along. You do 2 and 3 here and 2 and 3 here. But yeah, it's really, I think it's, the trail's kind of really gotten people, excited to come here and experience the history and meet the people, meet the distillers behind everything.
You just mentioned the number of tourists, which is a pretty impressive number, 2.5 million.
Yeah.
Where are these tourists coming from?
I believe 74% of them are from, obviously not in the state. They're from out of state. There are a lot of people who just love, especially after COVID, this number doubled. People just want that authentic experience, I think, now when they're planning vacations and whatnot. And, they're from all over. We've gotten, especially during the Kentucky Bourbon Festival in September, people come in from all over the world just for that 1 week of celebrating bourbon. I think they love the history of their favorite bourbon. They want to, meet the distiller and shake their hand and kind of try to feel like they're part of the business.
And you said that people find folks in Louisville friendly.
Yeah, and the whole state.
In the whole state.
Yeah.
So
we're not as friendly. Like even the smaller towns are probably more friendly than we are.
So is that part of the New South? Has that friendliness always been there? Or what's your impression of the South that you live in and thrive in now, as opposed to the South that maybe you arrived at once you graduated from college?
I think it's about the same. The South has always kind of had a welcoming vibe. Yeah, whether it be the Kentucky Derby or any other, people. We just always like to welcome people and throw parties and, make new friends. For what I understand, I think that's just an accurate stereotype of the South.
And and what do you think was the because that's a very warming stereotype.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there have been some pejorative ones as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think those were, and what do people find out upon visiting that may change their perceptions of what was the South?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of progressive businesses around the bourbon industry right now. We're very inclusive. I think people come here kind of expecting, are we going to see Confederate flags, or are people going to be welcoming? But Kentucky's kind of always been, it was a neutral state, but none of that is around here anymore, at least from my point of view. So people, I think, are shocked by that. We thought we were going. I think they're going to the deep South, and they're like, oh, this is a progressive city, and especially after the Derby, everybody wants to move here. I'm like, well, wait.
And given that you mentioned that history, one of the more interesting parts of this bourbon revolution happened in Tennessee with the discovery of Ernest Greene and his connection as an enslaved person to the development of Jack Daniel's whiskey.
Nathan Greene. Yeah.
Nathan Greene. I'm sorry, Nathan Greene.
Oh, yeah.
I know that some of the universities in Kentucky have started to study the history of enslaved people with the history of Kentucky bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about that, and how much of that has been included in the bourbon tour?
I think what Fawn Weaver is doing with Uncle Nearest and that brand is amazing. I think she's moving the industry forward, and I think the more that she digs up, that the more like you said, it kind of inspired. I think the program maybe at University of Kentucky is part of the James B. Beam Institute, but they're studying that. That's part of a curriculum now that they're kind of diving into, because every distillery, especially if it's been around, has a story, and they thrive on these stories. And I think when they unearth something like that, and they're happy to share it with as part of the story. I know that when Fawn found all that out, and Jack quickly put that as part of one of their tours. They put a section about Nathan Greene in their museum distillery type thing. So it's something that it's part of history, and as long as no one's trying to cover anything up like that, I think it's a positive thing.
In some of our other episodes, we've talked about how the South has looked to parts of its history, large parts of its history, that it would prefer not to talk about, certainly not to embrace, but slowly but surely have come to use it as part of tourism. And now you're reminding us that the same is true with bourbon, and we might celebrate Kentucky, or we might celebrate Tennessee for making whiskey, but is really at odds with the ethos of much of the South. So how hard has it been to get the state of Kentucky to embrace this idea that this once taboo topic can be something that can be celebrated and attractive to outsiders?
Right. I think once the politicians realize bourbon can help us, as a state, get attention, get money, get funds coming in. As soon as they realized that, it was a quick shift. In the past, I'd say 6 years, they've got so many of those laws overturned. We can now have restaurants at distilleries. You can now make cocktails. You can purchase bottles. All of that was, you weren't able to do that. We still have a ways to go. There's still some laws like shipping. So if you go out to Napa Valley and go to a winery, you can ship whatever you want home. But here, if someone comes here and they want, they don't want to take all these bottles on the plane, we're still not allowed to, we can only ship to 6 states.
Where does the bourbon tour now fit into the other tourist attractions in and around Louisville or in Kentucky? I know that shortly after the museum to Muhammad Ali opened,
Mm-hmm.
I remember going to that.
Yeah.
How did those two things maybe come together?
I think, the bourbon is what's bringing people to Louisville, but when they're here, they're getting a chance to, go to the Ali Museum, go to the Derby Museum, see all of these other things that, that weren't available without all of this bourbon tourism. And I think our city in particular did a great job of trying to get people to, we come to Kentucky to visit the trail, but stay in Louisville, And so they have been working hard to try to, more hotel rooms and more, kind of experiences like, the Ali Museum. We have a science center downtown, the History Museum. They definitely play up the fact that come to Louisville and then experience everything else.
Cool.
Now, one of the titles you also hold is Director of Whiskey at Cask X, which I think might be one of the coolest titles out.
Yeah. That might be what sold the job.
I would think so. If you can say the Director of Whiskey in Kentucky, I think that's akin to being like the King Pumbaa of rice and beans in South Carolina. But
right.
I do want to ask you about Cask X. What is your role there first? And the company itself, it specializes in selling whiskey cask portfolios to investors. Who exactly invest in whiskey and why? Yeah.
So as you mentioned, I'm the director of whiskey. And part of my job is to work with distilleries, use my connections to find distilleries that are willing to sell us bourbon by the barrel. Obviously, the average person can't take possession of a barrel of bourbon, but we buy so many from a distillery, and then we parcel it off and sell those to investors. And meanwhile, we keep those barrels stay at the distillery, just aging in the rickhouse. So we buy it as new make, and then we pay for 8 years of storage and insurance. So the idea is, in 8 years, you're going to have a pretty quality bourbon there. And so our investors, they're from the United States, and they have to be accredited investors. And so another part of my job is taking these clients around to check out the Bourbon Trail and then introduce them to Kentucky, and they can see their barrels and go touch them and feel them. So from what I've seen, just taking them around, they're bourbon fanatics. They love bourbon. They have a passion for it. They collect all the bottles, I think, for the most part. And they just kind of want to be a part of the industry and also are interested, the tangible asset type of investor.
Can we distill some of the myths about what bourbon actually is? What
Sure.
What is it and what is it not? Because you mentioned at the beginning that bourbon does not have to be made in Kentucky.
Right.
What is it that makes whiskey bourbon?
Yeah. So 1964, the government came out with the rules of what makes bourbon. And then bourbon is actually this country's only native spirit. So the rules are it must be made in America. So, you can't have any other country making bourbon. All bourbon is whiskey, but all whiskey is not bourbon. So that's another thing you'll hear at the distilleries. So let's see, it has to be made with at least 51% corn in the mash bill. The rest of the percentages is usually rye and malted barley, but some do use wheat instead of rye. But there actually is no age statement on bourbon. You could just, as long as it touches oak, it's automatically bourbon. But of course, you want to keep it in there for about 4 to 8 years, in my opinion. And the barrels that they use have to be brand new, charred oak barrels. So so all the other like Scotch, Irish whiskey, they can Canadian whiskey, they can use used barrels, and actually most of our bourbon barrels go over to Scotland and Ireland to put Scotch in. But no, I think that right now the bourbon industry is kind of poised to. We're looking at our export business. They're all every distillery is expanding because I think the goal is once we kind of. Scotch has most of the market right now. So if we could convert some Scotch drinkers, in India and China and Japan over to bourbon, then the sky's the limit.
So, Sarah, as we wind down this interview, I do have a quick question for you about Louisville culture in general, which is, what is one aspect of culture in Louisville that you believe most people outside of Louisville should be better aware of? Because I think we've talked a lot about, of course, the bourbon scene in Louisville. I think when folks think of Kentucky as a state, they think of either horse racing or college basketball. But what is it about Louisville in particular you think most folks should know about?
I think our culinary scene is actually top notch. And we get so many people saying, wow, who knew all these great chefs are here, great restaurants. And some of that is due to, we have a large UPS hub here. And so we have all this fresh seafood coming in daily. And all the chefs, go out there, and sometimes they're getting the freshest, lobster right out of the ocean. Just like an hour later, it's in Louisville. I don't think that's not the main reason, but I think it surprises people of, the 5-star restaurants that we have, the different cultures that we have here, and all the options that you can do.
Great. So are you a Southerner now?
Yes. I now have lived here in the South longer than I lived in Ohio. So
you are a Southerner.
I consider myself, yes, if you'll have me.
This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Robert, I don't think of Louisville as a destination for 5-star restaurants. That's a bit of a surprise. But also talking about the idea of the South embracing what heretofore had really been taboos about the South in terms of the enslavement of Africans and the illegal activity of making alcohol and running it from city to city and from state to state, and now embracing that as being bourbon culture. So I think the South has really come full circle on a lot of these ideas as to why it should invite people and how it can invite people to tour the South.
Now, in our New South, for both this season and last season, we've made the point over and over again of how there are many different Souths for folks to learn about. And I can't think of any better example of that than the two guests we've had on this episode, Tonya Mathews and Sara Havens, who are both heavily involved in the tourism industry and both heavily involved in trying to change the way folks think about Southern history and Southern culture. And Kevin, you're absolutely right. Both the International African American Museum and the Bourbon Trail introduce some different stories and different narratives of Southern history that most people aren't really used to hearing.
And then they kind of tie together when you talk about enslaved Africans and the fact that a number of them were involved in being the first people to make what we now talk about as being American bourbon or American whiskey. And we know about that, of course, through the story of Nearest Greene as being the first master distiller of what we now call Jack Daniel's whiskey. So I found that very interesting, too. And then I got to point out to you, Robert, that when you talk about tourism in the South, last October, on my own volition, I took in an Alabama-Tennessee football game in Tuscaloosa. 100,000 people, a beautiful day, an exciting game, and one of the reasons to go to the South, or another reason to go to the South, to take in this incredible sporting atmosphere environment called college football. And I don't think that anybody in the country does it better than the South.
Well, Kevin, I can't disagree there. As someone who holds degrees from both Georgia Southern University and University of South Carolina, I've had many a game day experiences on Saturdays in the fall in my younger days, which involve many stories I cannot tell on air. But I've seen college football at the SEC level, Southern Conference level, and working at Claflin across the street from South Carolina State University at the HBCU level as well. And what I can tell you is that all three levels show a unique and dedicated passion for college football that, again, as Kevin just pointed out, involves hospitality, involves tourism, and yes, involves a lot of absolute emotion and turmoil and angst. And that's just the first quarter.
It is a religion in the South.
folks. You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumoftheNewSouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to editor and sound designer Kyle Murdoch, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Piñeres, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frankie Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
Thanks for listening.
The South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.